Hey, I'm Shaye Wanner, and you are listening to the Casual Cattle Conversations podcast. Whether you are a seasoned rancher or just curious about the cattle world, this podcast dives into the stories, science, and strategies shaping the future of ranching. Let's get started and keep your herd ahead of the herd. Folks, today we are visiting with Bridgette and Lauren from the Rural Well podcast to provide some tips and insight to help ourselves and others with mental health. Both Bridgette and Lauren have production agriculture experience combined with a passion for helping others thrive in agriculture. We go straight to the point, and there's no BS in this one, so get ready for an impactful conversation. Remember, if you are looking for a speaker who can relate to ranchers, truly resonate with your audience, and get real about the realities of the cattle world, I'm booking for 2025 and 2026. You can reach out to me on my website, casualcattleconversations.com. But with that, let's visit with Bridgette and Lauren. Westway, we believe liquid feed has stood the test of time as a proven, effective, and efficient tool for delivering essential nutrients to livestock. Our molasses-based liquid feed provides essential protein, energy, and nutrients to keep your cattle healthy and productive. Liquid feed offers consistent, cost-effective nutrition, helping producers manage intake, control cost, and maximize feed resources. Learn more about why Westway is the best way to raise beef at www.westwayfeed.com or call 800-800-7517. And that information is also in the show notes. Well, Bridgette and Lauren, thank you for joining me for this conversation today. It's an important one for sure. And for those listening, we're going to be talking about mental health and ag and recognizing those signs in our loved ones and kind of what we can do to help ourselves and help each other out. So to get started with the fun for me question, but maybe not so easy for my guest question, I would like to know why each one of you, we're going to say bets on agriculture. Usually it's the beef industry, but why does each one of you bet on agriculture? And Bridgette, we'll start with you.
Sure. I think I can take this from the perspective of the beef industry and the fact that beef is one of the most demanded proteins in the consumer mind, certainly here in the United States. We have the safest, cheapest, and most abundant food supply in the world, and beef is a big part of that. The protein diets that folks are so focused on for the next while, I mean, you can call them a fad diet, but proteins don't go away. And I think that the trajectory we're on for the beef industry is going to stay strong for quite some time to come. It might not be, I paid off my herd in 1 year type strong, but I think we have the latitude for it to continue for some time. Now, overall in agriculture, we're a bright spot.
Lauren, why do you bet on the ag industry?
I think historically, we absolutely depend and will always depend on safe food across our countries. We absolutely depend on the connectedness to the land. And there's still some bright stories ahead on both sides of the border. I was recently at the Ontario Swine Conference, and we had a fellow from either Iowa, I think it was Idaho, come out and chat. And he was talking about, the soybean market won't be so good likely. Brazil's really picked up a lot of soybean production, but the beef market, as you mentioned, there's lots of hope there, lots of stability there. And so there's absolutely all sorts of reasons why we can bet on the beef market and on agriculture in general.
So Bridgette and Lauren, you two host the Rural Well podcast and are both passionate and focused about mental health. Why did you guys decide to start a podcast focused on mental health and agriculture? I mean, that's not an easy topic. It's an important one. It's one where there's been increasing focus, but how did each of you find your way to that space?
Completely by accident, because there were several of us that I saw through social media that I felt had a common thread, a lot having to do with proactively working on mental health. And I reached out to a group of women and said, I think we need to know each other, but I don't know why. Through that, the conversation continued for Lauren and I to continue to visit. And she said, I feel like this is leading us towards a podcast. And so we did. And that's where the Rural Well really came from. But Lauren has, whereas I'm mostly a layperson and I just want to be helpful, Lauren has the professional background that really beefs us up, if you will, in what we're talking about.
So I am a registered social worker, and I am currently a PhD student at the University of Guelph in Rural Studies. So I've had the absolute privilege of having my feet in both worlds, both the therapeutic world, and I am a farmer. I grew up on a hobby sheep farm. And then my dad switched to cattle, and we still raise sheep, and we have an on-farm bakery along with a farm store. So understanding how those two worlds interact is kind of a huge privilege for me. And so I work primarily with farmers. I would say probably 95% of my clientele are farmers. And it first started probably, let me see, probably about 2010 or 12 in there, maybe, actually, no, sorry, more 2014. Um, when I started seeing clients who were looking for services and they had gone to see a different therapist. One, for instance, had lost his fifth generation farm. And the therapist said to him, I don't really think it's that big a deal. Just save up some money and buy another farm. And then there was another situation involving a young teen who her and her dad had set to, success the farm to her. They had really put years and years of forethought into this succession plan. And then one day she basically woke up and she's like, actually, I want to become a veterinarian. And when she went to the first counselor, the counselor was like, "That's fantastic. Your dad will be so pleased." She said, "I don't think so." But the counselor was like, "No, he will be. I mean, you want to be a veterinarian and not a farmer." But dad wasn't so pleased. Dad was actually, understandably so, kind of devastated. And so those are two of the stories that really guided the creation of what we call the National Farmers Mental Health Alliance. And I'm the CEO of the National Farmers Mental Health Alliance, and I've partnered with other therapists to develop that program and that organization. But as Bridgette explained, we connected and both had this shared vision of a podcast. And I think because, we spend a lot of time in our tractors, we spend a lot of time where we have an opportunity to listen to podcasts or to watch podcasts. Actually, I was chatting with somebody the other day, and they had explained how Meta glasses, the number one customers of Meta glasses, are farmers. And so we have some technology that can aid us in giving us the opportunity to kind of sink deep into some truths that maybe we've avoided. And having a podcast is a way for us to learn a little bit more about health and wellness, but in a really unintimidating environment, in one in which we feel really comfortable.
Well, absolutely. And I think it's really cool and important the conversations you two are bringing to the podcast space. So, when we're looking at mental health in agriculture and rural communities, do you feel like farmers and ranchers and rural communities are at least starting to acknowledge the importance of just recognizing mental health, whether it's good or bad or in between, but just recognizing that it is something to be aware of? Is there more acknowledgement there?
I think there is. I see more availability of information. I see that whether it's through farm media, folks are really starting to pick up on what are the resources, where can I go when I need the help. So I do see an elevated awareness. But yet, just last month, I spoke to a group here in North Dakota and 200 farmers and ranchers in the room. And they told me at the end that I was the first person to be within their county who talked about rural mental health. And I thought, how? I feel like I'm on the back end of this and I'm coming in late to the party. But they didn't.
Absolutely. I see all sorts of farmers and farmer organizations recognizing the need to have these conversations and to really, I mean, farmers are fixers by nature. We need to have the tools, and then we fix it. We really work towards that process. But sometimes it's unfortunate because if you follow some posts and that sort of thing, you'll see somebody will post something about farmer mental health or farmer wellness. And there can be some really condescending comments that come from, I would say, a really small portion of our sector, but they can be really, really vocal. And unfortunately, it's those type of comments that actually induce even greater shame and make it even more difficult for somebody to actually say it's real.
So, when we're looking at mental health as individuals and who are involved in rural communities, who are involved on farms and ranches, what are maybe some signs of strong mental health that you see when you're visiting with people?
I think one of the really interesting and like foundational pieces when we see strong signs of wellness, mental health, and is an organization that has learned the art of communicating. The issue around communication means we can take the time to hear from one another, and we give some space when people are struggling to be able to approach, to validate, to clarify. And unfortunately, due to a whole host of reasons, sometimes that communication piece is really missing. Some farmers haven't felt safe to say, actually, I'm really struggling. in their organizations. And there's a whole, like I said, there's a whole host of reasons for it. One of the key pieces that we're really beginning to address is some of the generational pieces that have come down. I mean, in agriculture, when a number of individuals from the agriculture community immigrated to Canada and the US post World War II, and with it came some results of trauma. And there's been some really great work I've seen a number of families doing to kind of identify some of those kind of fallout of some of that trauma that we experienced, even if it was generations ago.
I do want to touch more on that generational trauma component later, but I also want to talk about, what are maybe some signs if we're looking at spouses, parents, grandparents, kids, friends, other family members that they might be struggling a little bit, but maybe just don't feel safe or don't know how to ask for help or express that they need it.
We really put kind of the signs into three main categories. The first one is emotional. And emotional means I go from feeling really sad to really happy, really sad, really happy. We have a hard time kind of regulating. Sometimes we'll just be spontaneously crying, and everybody around us is going, okay, what just happened? Because we were laughing one minute, now we're crying. So we see a lot of emotional kind of what we would call dysregulation. Sometimes we see it though when a farmer goes out to his or her shed, and before you know it, we're chucking screwdrivers and pliers and equipment across the shed because we can't find that one missing washer that we need in order to fix the power washer or whatever it is. And so we will see kind of a physical example, and yet it still comes from a place of just emotional feeling overwhelmed or extremely anxious. Anxiety is actually really prevalent in our communities. And anxiety it actually serves a purpose. Sometimes it almost kind of keeps us safe. It's why we put our seatbelts on, well, some of us when we go driving, hopefully everybody listening. But then another one would be behavioral changes. And so we'll see people begin to pull away. If you're one of those farmers who, meets for coffee Thursday mornings at the local cafe, and suddenly you're not going anymore, that would be one of those more behavioral signs. The third category would be self-harm or thoughts or communication about ending one's life. And all three are really important to pay attention to.
And I can add that there are ways to be looking for those categories. So first of all, you might see them just in their general behavior, major shifts and changes. But you know what? In our rural areas, particularly, I can speak to the United States, even though we have folks listening from multiple places, we are seeing more training to identify the concerns in others and their mental health, whether it's stress, anxiety, or as Lauren said, even self-harm. We're training our clergy, particularly for rural areas. There are actually targeted seminars for the clergy. Also, bankers, the loan officers, the grain merchandisers, the folks that are working at the elevator or the seed plant, they are actually not only going through training that's safety, but it's mental health focused for their customers as well as their peers. Farm camps for kids. North Dakota State University puts on a farm and ranch safety camp, and it's not just about hooking up hydraulic hoses and being careful around PTOs. Now they're talking about mental health for the whole family. From a kid perspective, what are you seeing in your parents or in the farming partnership? We're asking when it comes to elder care, whether it's at nursing homes, retirement villages, we are asking others. It's becoming more mainstream to ask if grandma's okay because she's alone a lot. And then also there are first aid training courses for mental health. They're offered here in the state of North Dakota. Other states host them as well. So by all means, being able to take those classes, I've been through one. It's 8 hours. Not everything is perfectly applicable to living in a town of 300 people versus living in a town of 100,000. But there are pieces that will help you, as simple as Lorena always says, coming alongside someone and being able to say, are you okay? And if you're not okay, could we make this phone call together? Because I happen to have the phone number for the AgriStress hotline that's answered by people in agriculture who can relate to you. So they don't make an unfortunate comment like Loren said of, well, just save up some money and do something different, because that's not how it works for many in their farming lives. So there are more and more opportunities for people to learn and to be able to help each other.
Absolutely. And thank you for both of you for sharing your experiences and thoughts there. Loren, it looked like you had something else you were going to chime in.
Well, I can't help but after this conversation is just understanding the breadth of support that's out there. So our organization, the National Farmers Mental Health Alliance, we're actively training therapists in the US who have lived agriculture experience to be able to work effectively with farmers because we are a unique breed. We're not, some of the more traditional or some of the other typical type of therapeutic approaches don't work. You might hear a clinician say, "Oh, well, you should take a vacation." I will never say that to a farmer. I will just never say it, because even if you think it would be helpful for me to take a vacation, there is nothing relaxing about it because everything blows up when I'm away on vacation. And so, somebody who's listening is in the agriculture industry and mental health, I'd invite them to check out the National Farmers Mental Health Alliance because we have active training both for therapists and for farmers. There's a couple of new programs coming out for farmers and their families so they can thrive.
Are you trying to make your brand stand out as a rural business owner? I've got a great recommendation for you. My friend Hannah Nelson is the owner of Rural Way Promotions and grew up on a farm in western Nebraska, so she understands the heart of rural businesses and knows how to create a brand that resonates with your customers. Whether you need website design, brand photography, logo design, or social media management, Hannah's expertise will help you craft a cohesive and professional online presence. She's passionate about working with rural businesses to help you get your products and services online, while also growing your presence on social media and making sure your brand stands out. Reach out to Hannah today by visiting ruralwaypro.com, and that link is in the show notes. So, what do you do differently than for farmers and ranchers when you're working with them individually to help them?
That's probably one of those wild questions because it can be a huge range of things. But typically, for instance, we talk about a therapist not self disclosing very much about their own life. But when I work with farmers, we talk about our beans. And, that's part of building a therapeutic alliance. Part of us coming alongside one another is understanding some of the unique stressors that we face. Some of the other things that we do, if we do some discussion around how to decrease stress, it'll be interrelated with your activities on the farm rather than going and doing yoga in town or doing a 30-minute workout or something like that. We just make sure that it's really farm friendly. So we often use what we would call experiential approaches, which means we build an experience with it. But there's a number of different, it depends if we're dealing with a multi-generational farm and we're talking about succession. It means we sometimes develop some different rules for how we have conversations as a family during a family time and how we have conversations as a family when we're talking about succession and we're sitting around the table. So even though those two worlds are very interrelated, we still have to sometimes set some boundaries. So it certainly depends on what the issue is. But the reality is it's farm focused and farm family focused and not from a textbook.
So I do want to circle back to, you brought up kind of generational trauma, and mental health can be impacted by, oh, it's getting really dry. Are we going to get rain? All the way to succession planning, death in the family. I mean, anything, but that generational trauma piece is becoming more and more prevalent in the space. I think more people are open to talking about it, and maybe that's just because more people are starting to discover more about it. Can you, one or both of you, share more about what that generational trauma is and how it does impact mental health from generation to generation?
Yeah, great question, Shay. The reality when it comes to generational trauma is we're impacted whether we kind of agree to be or not. Generational trauma actually carries down the genetic line for 4 to 5 generations if no further trauma occurs. And the way it's carried down is through something we call epigenetics. It's how things are expressed in our DNA. So it actually carries down the DNA. And there's all sorts of incredible studies that discuss how these findings have came to be. But you can, and many people will go back and say, oh, so the old nurture versus nature war. The reality is this: post World War II, we had a number of people who came to the Americas and began farming. But before they left their homeland, they were in a great famine. I mean, people in the Scandinavian countries were eating tulip bulbs and wallpaper to try and survive. My in-laws came, my husband's adoptive parents, who were incredible, incredible people. And in fact, on their trip over, to add a little even more to it, in the 1950s, their boat hit, I think it was an iceberg, and they had to actually get off and get onto a different boat. So to add even more, to the whole experience of immigrating, it's not just like, oh, we got on a boat and we got here. Like, no, there's a lot of pieces of that puzzle that went into that. And so post World War II, what we would say is those people were in what we would call survivor mode. And survival mode is just like, every decision I make comes from this lens of my goal is to survive, and my goal is that my family survives. Every decision I make was about survival. And so when they got to Canada or the US and they stepped on soil here, do we really think that all of that survival mode just disappeared? The reality is no, it absolutely didn't. In fact, they started farming in survival mode. And so many of those farmers, they didn't take, in Canada, there was some different kind of benefits for farmers, or old age security, or some of those different farming grants, particularly in the 1980s, that were more prevalent. And a lot of those immigrant families said absolutely no, they would not accept it. And the reason for that is they were afraid the government would then be able to come and take their farm away from them. And so because of it, that survival mode perpetuated. It's one of the reasons, though, why a number of those farmers are super successful, like ingenious farmers. But it came at a cost. And typically that cost came through what we call the dark side of resilience. And that's when we've had to be resilient time and time and time again. We're having to be resilient. It's like an overused muscle. And what the cost of overused muscle, that cost of overused resilience, is relationship. Our ability to be vulnerable, our ability to say, this is really hard, our ability to connect with other people. Because if we're in survival mode and our goal is to survive, we don't often take that opportunity to really connect with other people and hear other people and understand different perspectives. And so that's how we see it lived out. Now, kind of present day, we have on-farm accidents. The weather, if you have gone through recently here, we had heavy snow loads along in some of our barns. And in fact, some of our swine barns collapsed. And, whether you're a veterinarian or a farmer, when you are going through a barn fire or a roof collapse, and that is very traumatic, very, very difficult. And what happens is sometimes we just, because we've got to be resilient, we pack away. We call farmers ruggers. And I'm a farmer, so I think I can say this pretty safely. We lift up the rug, we shove all of the crap underneath that rug, and we drop the rug hoping it will somehow magically disappear. And we've done that with trauma. It doesn't disappear. It actually carries down the generational line. There's only 3 things you can do with trauma. You can hold it, you can transfer it, or you can transform it, but you've only got 3 options. So for those who have experienced trauma, my goal at the National Farmers Mental Health Alliance, Bridget's goal, and the work that we do together at the Rural Well, is to help farmers transform it to become something of a steady foundation for them that they've grown from rather than succumb to.
Because we've been not only sweeping it under the rug, we've hidden it with the accessible and acceptable use of alcohol, other vices, abuse, and sometimes it culminates in the farm accident. And I use air quotes there because not all accidents were accidents. So yeah, our goal through what we do with the Rural Well is to make sure that, as Lauren mentioned, we find ways for folks to take care of that trauma in their lives.
So because I have, through my own interest, learned a little bit about that and can follow what you're saying, I kind of understand where you're going with that when you talk about transforming the trauma. But for those who are maybe just like, well, trauma, that feels really heavy, they're thinking, well, I don't have any trauma. Like, none of that happened to me. Like, how could that possibly be? What does transforming that trauma look like when someone recognizes that something needs to change and they start taking those steps?
Yeah, great question. I think the first thing we need to do is actually normalize it a little bit. Now, it's important for people to understand it's not the actual trauma that you experience, it's how you process that trauma. It's the fallout kind of from that trauma. So it's important for people to understand, because for some, sometimes I work with women who have gone through a miscarriage or postpartum depression or something like that, and we think that that's not traumatic. And it's like, it actually is a form of trauma. Now, the other statistic that's important for people to know is 66% of the American population have experienced trauma, and that doesn't include individuals who have been homeless or engaged in the child welfare system. So that's a huge number. And I would argue for women in rural areas, that number is actually higher because unfortunately, there's a higher level of intimate partner violence in rural communities, something like as high as 30% higher. So it's actually a really significant stat. But if we were to put that kind of aside, the reality when it comes to trauma is, first of all, we want to normalize it. As much as we think, oh, we haven't been impacted by it, we are all kind of a product of our own experiences. And it's a beautiful thing. There's value in every person. If you're living, if you're breathing, you have value. You have inherent value. There's a purpose for why you're here. And so when you can take that trauma and realize how it's impacted you and how you can transform it to motivate you to help others, walk alongside others, or try other strategies, then you've transformed it.
Thank you for walking us through that and providing insight into that, because it is, like I mentioned earlier, mental health has been one thing, but I feel like that word trauma, especially the generational trauma, is something that's really just starting to be brought up in the last couple of years.
I think you're right. And Bridgette's nodding as well. I think it's important for us to understand that why we shy away from that word trauma. Because, we don't want to kind of take away from the experience of somebody who's gone through something really painful. I think about my brother and sister-in-law, and their son passed away 10 years ago of invasive group A strep pneumonia. So that was absolutely a traumatic event. And for somebody else who maybe hasn't gone through so much hard trauma, we're reluctant to kind of put ourselves in that same category. And I think respectfully, like I get that. The reality is it's not the event, it's how we process the event. And so trauma is it's part of your story. And it doesn't mean that we have to equate one with the other. It doesn't mean, oh, well, yours is real and mine's not. That's not how it's not how we view it at all.
Well, and it's like you said, the person's not the problem is the problem. But I don't think we necessarily recognize that, whether that's, explicitly trauma or maybe some anxiety and depression. We think, oh, something's wrong with us.
No, you're right. And the more that we can kind of take it outside ourselves and realize it speaks to us, it has an influence perhaps on our lives, maybe sometimes because we've given it power. But we're not the problem. I often say to people, I don't know, do either of you remember watching Tom and Jerry? Like as a kid? Okay, so remember you'd have like a devil on one side and the angel on the other. That's honestly what anxiety can do. It can sit on one side, it can whisper in your ear, and it acts like a bully. And it just is like, well, what about this? And what about this? And before you know it, a person will say, oh, it's my anxiety, or I overthink things too much. Well, no, it's that you've got this darn devil kind of character called anxiety or worry or fear that sits on your shoulder and talks to you and has a little too much power in your life. And so there's ways that you can work to minimize how much power you give away to that.
So, Bridgette, when you are out in the field or in contact with other producers and you start to recognize that something's off, what are some questions you ask just to check in and acknowledge them?
So understand that not everybody is going to be willing to share the first go around, right? The first time I ask and question with someone, they're not always going to spill their guts no matter how close we are. But it also makes a difference in your setting. So I think about going to ride in the buddy seat in a tractor, hanging out in the barn, and someplace that gives them a feeling of comfort where it's their, I don't want to use the word safe space, but it's their comfort space. You start by simply asking, how are you? Hey, you know what? This late spring, it's not my favorite for planting corn. It's cold out there. How are you handling it? Do you have any advice for me? If you help them feel that they're helping you, I believe that opens up a little bit of a door. And I know Loren's the professional. She can make sure that I'm doing this the right way. And then being quiet. It's super hard to sit with silence, but allowing that silence gives someone else the chance to gather their thoughts, get their nerves up, and you have to be non-judgmental about it. When they tell you, I'm not doing great. Really? How are you not doing great? Can you tell me more? Doesn't have to be intrusive, just needs to come across kind and caring. And if you can start in those ways, I've found that it's been really helpful. I've done this completely wrong, and thank God. nothing bad has come of it. But making the effort, you'd be surprised how often later on someone might walk by you and clap you on the shoulder and say, I appreciate that you asked. That maybe opened the door for them to do something different or make an improvement in some way that they weren't expecting.
Yeah, I couldn't agree with you more because really what you're talking about there is the use of curiosity. And curiosity is just using open-ended questions so they don't end in yes or no or fine. That's where everybody goes to church and they're like, "Oh, how are you?" "Fine." We don't really know how somebody's doing. But open-ended questions are tell me about, help me understand. Can you paint a picture for me as to what that would look like? That kind of thing. And so using open-ended questions in your conversation is really important because we allow somebody else to say what's really on their mind and we can follow them down there. Now, farmers are notorious for using what we call alternative stories. So I'll have a farmer say to me, "Oh man, the beans didn't catch this very well this year, and I think the price is going to drop. And I've got these big farm bills because my tractor is just blew an engine. And, my wife's really sick and out on the farm. I don't know if I'm going to be able to get my beans harvested in time because the cold snap's coming and blah, blah, blah." Well, the alternative story, the piece that's really causing that farmer stress is my wife's deal. Because we're kind of like dipping our toe in the water, not sure if we can really trust you with our conversation with the hard stuff that we're really dealing with. And so as somebody who's listening to a farmer and coming alongside, a friend, a family member. As I said, I am a farmer, and so I catch myself doing this sometimes too. It's so humbling when I'm having a conversation. I'm like, oh, I just totally rugged that, just totally swept that right under the rug. But if you can pull out that alternative story, that's really important. And the last piece, if I have a little bit of time left, is that piece about validation. And Bridgette, you're going to nod your head because she's probably heard me say this 100 times, but validation is like the missing link. In fact, if you have any relationship in your life that you care about, you have to learn how to validate them. When my husband and I first started farming, so he grew up on a potato farm, I grew up on a hobby sheep farm. So when we kind of came together and we bought our farm, we really thought he was going to be like Dick Van Dyke and I'm Mary Poppins. Like, it's just going to be so wonderful. And we're going to take the kids out there and we're going to work together and we're going to raise these sheep and, kumbaya. And within a very short period of time, he was going out there to do the grunt labor. And then he'd come in the house and I would go out and do all the other. And we weren't actually together. We were just getting the job done. And then one day we realized what was going on. Like, now this is going to shock your listeners, but there's two different ways to like spread straw. There's two different ways to fill a bill feeder.
Or at least there's two different ways that a marriage can see that, right? Two different ways that the husband and wife see it.
That's right. And so we learned really quickly. Well, it wasn't really quickly, but when we did, we grabbed onto it. He was looking for me to say, "Wow, babe, you really know what you're doing here." And I was looking for him to say, "Wow, babe, you really know how to farm." Like, we were both looking for the same thing. So we have to learn how to validate one another around us.
Do you have big ambitions for your operation, but feel like you get so caught up in the day-to-day fires that you are just spinning in circles? You aren't alone. I've been in your shoes and know just how frustrating it can be. That's why I created Move the Ranch Forward. It's a guide for ranchers. This guide is a PDF that contains the exact process my husband and I use to stay focused on our goals throughout the year, even when life throws us curveballs. You can access Move the Ranch Forward today at casualcattleconversations.com. So my question about validation is, so there's the 5 love languages. So do people like to be validated differently? We'll just stay on track with the spousal theme. So how do you know how to best validate your spouse? Because how I like to be validated might be different than how my husband likes to be validated.
I think validation is really kind of coming into a form of agreement with one another, right? So it doesn't mean I agree with everything you say. And yes, we can do that differently. So for instance, if I've worked really long hours, I've been out in the barn up through the night and I come home or come in the house and my husband's like, "You know what, you sleep. I'm going to go and get Chris up." So, or I'm going to go and do some of these other chores that I have to do. That's a form of validation because he sees me. He sees my need. He sees what something has just cost me. So yeah, that's a form of validation. So definitely, along the lines of the 5 love languages. But validation it doesn't even require that much of us, because it's really coming into this kind of form of agreement without having to kind of blindly just take sides or blindly say one thing over the other. So for instance, if you looked outside right now and you saw this big, beautiful blue sky and said, wow, look at that big, beautiful blue sky. But I looked up at the sky and I saw, it's got a lot of purple going on here. This is a purple sky. It means a tornado, a little green sky is coming, a tornado's coming. Well, maybe not if there's a tornado coming. We would definitely overrule and take shelter there. But, if I saw a different color sky, I've got two choices. I can correct my partner, I can correct my husband, or I can say, wow, look at that color. Isn't that amazing? I think a lot of times validation, people see it as a disempowering thing, that I have to agree with whatever you say, but that's not validation at all. Validation just means we kind of like, wow, there's enough space for us to have different opinions on something and still be okay with that.
So, kind of moving into a little bit of a different topic and question, when we look at how, Bridgette, you brought up earlier that NDSU is doing these farm safety trainings and they're doing that with the kids, right? They're talking about this with the kids. And, I see how I handle things is different than how my parents handle things and how my grandparents certainly handle things. So, how do each of you see different generations approaching mental health differently?
Oh, I see a huge difference in what kids know today. I think back to when I was 15 years old and Dad sold the dairy cows. It was the height of the 1988 drought. It was time for the cows to go, financially speaking, etc. And I know there's an argument for this, but yet I firmly believe that there's no one as tied to their livestock as a dairy farmer. And I didn't have the language at 15 years old to say, I think my dad is depressed right now. But I do know that at 15 years old, my kids knew that word, and they could have figured it out. So generally, rationally, the younger we are, the more we acknowledge. Yet, that crowd I mentioned earlier of the 200 who said this is the first time someone's talked about mental health in our community, in our county, I had some ladies who are in their 80s who came up and said, you made it okay for me to ask. So we're hearing it. People are recognizing it more. It comes easier the younger we are, I think, but don't discount everyone. The change is happening. We are willing to be more caring about everybody around us.
I couldn't agree. Absolutely. I could not agree more. Last week, too, I was at a speaking engagement up in Durham area. I had this lady come over to me. She must have been, yeah, late 80s, like really. And with a bit of a tear in her eye, after I had explained generational trauma and validation, she said, I never knew why my parents didn't encourage me and validate me until tonight. And she said, everything you said is absolutely how my family did life. And so I see a bit of an awakening, to be honest, among some of our older farmers. I have a number of older farmer clients that are looking for, my relationship with my son who's taking over my farm, or my daughter who's taking over my farm, isn't what it needs to be. How do I get there? And certainly in the younger generation, there's a little bit more language around mental health and those pieces. And there's a desire to be understood and to kind of address some of those generational pieces that we talked about earlier. I'm very hopeful. I've got to be honest, I'm actually very hopeful. I think the agriculture industry is willing to change and willing to learn these skills and to improve the situation.
You guys, I'm not going to be Pollyanna about this, but the way that changes most people the fastest, there is a farmer suicide in their neighborhood. Whether they are younger, older, male, female, it doesn't matter what generation. When someone dies tragically by suicide in their farm community, that is a rude and abrupt wake-up call that folks really take notice, and then they want to see change.
Which calls us to say, let's not wait for that to happen, right? Let's have those hard conversations. It's actually okay. If you notice somebody struggling, it's okay for you to say, hey, I might be way off base here. Don't hit me for it, but I care about you. Are you struggling with the idea of living? Or have you had some really dark thoughts? Because the interesting thing is just asking that question makes people go, ah, you see me. Doesn't mean everybody's going to start dishing out all their deepest, darkest secrets and problems, but it's this feeling of like I'm seen, people notice me, people care about me. And in our isolated world on the farm, that's a really important piece.
Absolutely. Well, I think we could talk about this for hours if we really wanted to dig into stuff, but I want to respect everyone's time. So, to wrap things up, what resources would each of you like to share?
I think that something folks can take the fastest and the most easily, and they can program it into their phone, because I encourage this every time I'm in front of a group that you do so. And that is the phone number for the agri-stress helpline. It's available 24/7. This is folks answering the phone in a respectful way. They have a farm background. They're very kind and caring. And they will help you talk through your anxiety, your depression, and they will help elevate you to places that can be of more service. And that phone number is 833-897-2474.
Yeah, and I think, of course, part of the goal of the company that I have the privilege of kind of leading is to be that. We have a 1-800 number that's available in the US and in Canada. So you can reach out to a therapist who's agriculturally informed, but it's not free. And so certainly I appreciate what Bridgette just shared as well. There's all sorts of great blogs on our website, and I'm sure there's a whole host of other resources. The Angel Network is one in the US that has done some really great work.
That's based out of Wisconsin.
Yeah. And the other piece that I think is really important for people to know is don't stop trying. I think sometimes as farmers, we don't go to see a therapist until we're at our kind of 11th hour, like we're in crisis. And if it's not the perfect fit, then we go, well, I tried counseling and we walked away. So it's important for us to really understand, like, there's a bit of a long-term process. Sometimes it's not. Lots of times I have farmers who come to see me and it's 1 or 2 sessions and they've gotten the tools they need and they're thriving again, which is probably more often than not. But I would encourage people to keep knocking on that door, keep reaching out, because you do have incredible value.
All right. Well, I will include those resources as well as links to connect with both Bridgette and Lauren in the show notes for those who are listening. And I do want to remind you, if you're listening on the audio form, that this is also on YouTube too. So if you are more of a YouTuber, you can check us out there. But with that, be sure to look at those resources as well as any other resources that were mentioned in the show. Take care of yourself and your family, and happy ranching, folks.